The phone rang at 6:23 a.m. on Thursday, 11th September 2025. Keir Starmer was already awake, sitting at his desk in Downing Street, staring at his computer screen. He'd been up since 4:47 a.m., reading the Bloomberg article for the 7th time, the emails, the birthday book, the best pal message, the "I think the world of you" note sent to a convicted sex offender, and worst of all, the advice on how to fight the conviction. He knew what he had to do. He'd known since the moment the first email was published, but he'd spent nearly 24 hours pretending he didn't. Yesterday, he'd stood in Parliament and declared he had full confidence in Peter Mandelson. He'd insisted that due process was followed in the appointment. He'd defended his ambassador, his friend, his political godfather. And now, less than one day later, he was about to fire him. The call lasted 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Neither man has revealed what was said, but sources close to both suggest it was brief, cold, and final. At 11:34 a.m., the Foreign Office released a statement that would define Keir Starmer's premiership. Peter Mandelson, the Prince of Darkness, Labour royalty, the man who'd helped build New Labour and win 3 elections, was gone, fired, disgraced, destroyed by his friendship with one of the most notorious criminals in modern history. And Keir Starmer, who'd appointed him despite knowing about those links, was about to learn that some mistakes in politics are unforgivable. To understand how catastrophic this scandal was for Labour, you need to understand who Peter Mandelson is. Born in 1953, he's been at the heart of British politics for 4 decades. He wasn't just a politician, he was the political operator, the spin doctor, the strategist, the man who transformed Labour from an unelectable socialist party into a slick, modern, election-winning machine. In the 1980s and 1990s, working alongside Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, Mandelson created New Labour. They ditched the red flags and clause for socialism. They embraced business, markets, and middle-class voters. And in 1997, they won the biggest landslide in British political history. Mandelson became a cabinet minister twice. He resigned twice over scandals involving wealthy businessmen. But he always came back, always survived, always found a way to remain relevant. By 2025, he was 71 years old, semi-retired, running a consultancy firm. Watching from the sidelines as Labour, under Keir Starmer, finally returned to power after 14 years of Conservative government. And then Starmer made the call that would destroy both their career. In February 2025, the Prime Minister appointed Peter Mandelson as Britain's ambassador to the United States, not a career diplomat, not a foreign policy expert, a political operator. A controversial, scandal-prone political operator with a nickname like Prince of Darkness. It was a nakedly political appointment, and everyone knew it. The reaction was immediate. Conservatives attacked it as cronyism. Liberal Democrats questioned Mandelson's suitability. Even some Labour MPs privately worried about giving such a sensitive role to someone with Mandelson's history. But there was one concern that dominated all others: Jeffrey Epstein. Because Peter Mandelson's friendship with the convicted sex offender and trafficker wasn't a secret. It had been reported in 2019, when Epstein's crimes became global news. Photos existed of Mandelson at Epstein's properties. Flight logs showed he'd traveled on Epstein's private jet. A Channel 4 documentary had detailed their relationship. Court documents from JP Morgan's internal investigation described Mandelson as having a particularly close relationship with Epstein. Everyone knew. The security services knew. They'd reportedly warned Starmer before the appointment. The media knew. They'd questioned it extensively. The public knew. Polls showed 67% of voters thought someone with Epstein links shouldn't be ambassador. And Keir Starmer knew. He'd been briefed. He'd read the reports. He'd seen the concern. And he appointed Mandelson anyway. Why? Because Starmer believed he needed Mandelson's experience, his contacts, his political skills, to manage the relationship with Donald Trump's administration. Because he thought the Epstein connection was old news, already public, already priced. Because he fundamentally misjudged how toxic that association would become. For 7 months, it seemed like Starmer's gamble might work. Mandelson arrived in Washington in February. He met with Trump administration officials. He attended state functions. He gave interviews defending British interests. Yes, journalists occasionally asked about Epstein. And Mandelson had a standard response. He'd met Epstein socially in the early 2000s. He deeply regretted the association. He'd had no knowledge of Epstein's crimes. He felt sympathy for the victim. It was carefully calibrated, defensive, but not apologetic, acknowledging the connection, but minimizing it. And for 7 months, it held, until Monday, 8 September 2025. That's when the US House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform released documents from their Epstein investigation. Among them was a birthday book, compiled in 2003 for Epstein's 50th birthday. It contained messages from some of the world's most powerful people, presidents, princes, billionaires, and on page 47, a handwritten note from Peter Mandelson. The message was accompanied by a photo of the two men together, both smiling, and the text read, "To Jeffrey, my best pal, an intelligent, sharp-witted man, but wherever he is in the world, he remains my best pal." The reaction was instantaneous. "Epstein's best pal is UK ambassador," screamed the Daily Mail. "Prince of Darkness called sex offender his best friend," reported The Sun. Social media erupted. Epstein's victims spoke out, expressing horror that someone who'd been so close to their abuser held such a senior diplomatic position. But the birthday book was just the beginning, because someone had been digging deeper, and what they found would end Peter Mandelson's career forever. On Wednesday, 10th September, Bloomberg and The Sun published a trove of emails between Mandelson and Epstein. Not from 2003, not from before Epstein's crimes were known, from 2006 onwards. After Epstein had been indicted, after the allegations were public, after everyone knew what kind of man Jeffrey Epstein was. The first email was from October 2006, just after Epstein had been charged. Mandelson wrote, offering support and suggesting Epstein read Sundew's The Art of War for strategic advice on how to fight back. Then came June 2008, just before Epstein began his prison sentence. After pleading guilty to soliciting prostitution from a minor, Mandelson wrote, "I think the world of you and I feel hopeless and furious about what has happened. I can still barely understand it. It just could not happen in Britain. You have to be incredibly resilient, fight for early release, and be philosophical about it as much as you can." The language was damning. "I think the world of you," to a convicted sex offender, fight for early release, helping a criminal minimize his punishment. It just could not happen in Britain, suggesting the conviction was unjust. But the worst was yet to come. The emails showed that Mandelson had offered to use his political connections to help Epstein. In one message, Epstein mentioned a meeting with Mr. Big and asked Mandelson to remind him one time before the meeting. Mandelson replied cryptically about Gordon Brown, then Prime Minister, having met with someone one-on-one. The clear implication was that Mandelson had been willing to leverage his access to the Prime Minister to assist Jeffrey Epstein. Another email chain from 2008 showed Epstein asking if Mandelson knew Florida Governor Charlie Crist, who could be instrumental in a pardon. Mandelson didn't explicitly refuse. He just said he didn't have that connection. The message was clear. If he could have helped get Epstein a pardon, he would have considered it. And throughout the emails, there was a consistent theme. Mandelson believed Epstein was the victim of an unjust prosecution. He thought the conviction was wrong. He wanted to help his friend fight it. Even after Epstein had pleaded guilty, even after the evidence was public, even after multiple victims had come forward, Peter Mandelson, the Prince of Darkness, one of Britain's most senior diplomats, had stood by a convicted child sex offender, and Keir Starmer had appointed him anyway. The political explosion was immediate and devastating. By Wednesday afternoon, Parliament was in emergency session. Kemi Badenoch, the Conservative leader, was merciless. "I asked the Prime Minister about Peter Mandelson's links to Jeffrey Epstein 6 times at Prime Minister's questions," she told the Commons. 6 times he could not provide answers. He gave his full backing to a man unfit for office. This matters because the Prime Minister has been distracted from serious national security and economic challenges. He is weak, doesn't have courage to do the right thing at the right time. She was right, and everyone knew it. Liberal Democrat leader Ed Davey demanded Starmer come to Parliament to explain why Mandelson had been appointed in the first place. Former Conservative Minister David Davis highlighted that this was Mandelson's 3rd resignation from government over scandals involving wealthy, controversial figures. "This shows the sheer size of the failure of the vetting process," he said. Labour backbenchers sat in silence. Many were furious. They'd spent years attacking Conservative sleaze and cronyism. They'd won the 2024 election, promising to restore integrity to government, and now their Prime Minister had appointed someone who'd called Jeffrey Epstein his best pal to one of Britain's most important diplomatic posts. The pressure on Starmer was unbearable, and still he tried to defend his decision. At Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday afternoon, Starmer insisted that due process was followed in Mandelson's appointment. He said he had full confidence in his ambassador. He claimed that the birthday book message was taken out of context, but nobody was listening anymore, because by 5:47 p.m. Wednesday, a second bombshell had dropped. The Sun published an interview with Mandelson himself, conducted that afternoon. In it, the ambassador admitted that more very embarrassing details of his friendship with Epstein would emerge. He called Epstein a charismatic criminal liar, and said he deeply regretted maintaining their association far longer than I should have. It was a confession, an admission that the relationship had been closer, longer, and more compromising than he'd previously acknowledged, and it was the final nail in his coffin. By 8 p.m. Wednesday, Labour MPs were openly calling for Mandelson's resignation. By 9 p.m., cabinet ministers were privately telling Downing Street that he had to go. By 10 p.m., Keir Starmer was alone in his study, reading through the Foreign Office briefings about what the security services had told him before the appointment. They'd warned him, they'd flagged Epstein, they'd raised concerns, and he'd ignored them all, because he wanted Peter Mandelson's political skills, because he thought he could manage the controversy, because he fundamentally miscalculated how much the British public cared about protecting a child sex offender's friend. At 6:23 a.m. Thursday morning, Starmer made the call. At 11:34 a.m., the announcement came: Peter Mandelson was fired. The Foreign Office statement was clinical. The emails show that the depth and extent of Peter Mandelson's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein is materially different from that known at the time of his appointment. In particular, Peter Mandelson's suggestion that Jeffrey Epstein's first conviction was wrongful and should be challenged is new information. In light of that, and mindful of the victims of Epstein's crimes, he has been withdrawn as ambassador with immediate effect. Mandelson sent an email to embassy staff. It was dignified, professional, and devastating. Being ambassador here has been the privilege of my life, he wrote. The circumstances surrounding the announcement today are ones which I deeply regret. I continue to feel utterly awful about my association with Epstein 20 years ago and the plight of his victims. But regret doesn't undo damage, and the damage to Labour was catastrophic, because this wasn't just about Peter Mandelson anymore. This was about Keir Starmer's judgment, his priorities, his willingness to ignore warnings and appoint compromised people to sensitive positions, and the British public was watching. Within hours, the polls shifted. Labour's support dropped by 6 points overnight. The Conservatives gained 3 points. Reform UK gained another 3. More devastatingly, Starmer's personal approval ratings collapsed to their lowest level ever. Just 11% of voters said they trusted his judgment. 82% said the Mandelson appointment showed he prioritized political connections over integrity. 73% said he should have known about the Epstein emails before appointing him. The editorials were brutal. A catastrophic failure of judgment, wrote The Times. Starmer's credibility is destroyed, declared The Telegraph. Even The Guardian, generally sympathetic to Labour, admitted this is a self-inflicted wound that will haunt the government. But the real damage wasn't in the headlines. It was in the conversations happening in living rooms, workplaces, and pubs across Britain. They're all the same. Politicians protect their own. They promise to be different, but they're just as corrupt as the Tories. Labour had spent 14 years rebuilding trust, promising a new kind of politics, pledging to restore integrity to government. And Keir Starmer had destroyed that in 7 months by appointing a man who'd defended Jeffrey Epstein. The political consequences came quickly. On Friday, 12th September, 3 Labour MPs publicly called for a leadership challenge. One, a former shadow cabinet minister, told The Guardian, Starmer's judgment is fatally compromised. He knew about Epstein. He was warned by security services, and he appointed Mandelson anyway. That's not a mistake. That's a choice. And it's a choice that shows he's not fit to be Prime Minister. By Saturday, that number had grown to 7 MPs. By Monday, it was 12. The rebellion was small, but significant, because these weren't backbench troublemakers. These were serious politicians many elected in 2024, expressing genuine concern about their leader's competence. The Conservative Party, recovering from their own catastrophic defeat, suddenly saw an opening. Kemi Badenoch gave a major speech on Tuesday, 16th September, the day Trump arrived in London for his state visit. "This government promised integrity," she said. "They promised to be different from us. And in 7 months, they've appointed a man who called a child sex offender his best pal to be ambassador, lost 8 ministers to scandals, and shown contempt for the British people's intelligence. If this is the new politics, Britain deserves better." The speech resonated because she was right. Labour had promised better. They'd won on that promise, and they'd failed spectacularly to deliver. But the most damaging commentary came from an unexpected source. On Wednesday, 17th September, the New York Times published an editorial titled, "Britain's Broken Promise." It read, "When Labour won power in July 2024, they promised to restore Britain's reputation after years of conservative chaos. Instead, they appointed an ambassador who supported a convicted sex offender, defended him for 24 hours after the evidence emerged, then fired him under pressure. This isn't competence. This is cowardice, and it raises serious questions about whether Keir Starmer has the judgment required to lead a major democracy." The editorial was devastating because it came from America, because it suggested that Britain's closest ally had lost confidence in its government, because it implied that the special relationship was damaged not by Donald Trump's volatility, but by Keir Starmer's incompetence. Back in Britain, the crisis deepened. James Roscoe, Mandelson's deputy, was promoted to interim ambassador. He was competent, professional, and completely unknown. Nobody doubted his diplomatic skills, but everyone recognized that Britain had lost political clout in Washington. Mandelson, for all his flaws, was a heavyweight. He had contacts, he had experience, he understood power. Roscoe was a career diplomat who'd spent most of his career managing protocol and coordinated visits. The downgrade was obvious, and it mattered, because Donald Trump's administration was unpredictable, aggressive, and demanding. Britain needed a heavyweight to navigate that relationship. Instead, they had an interim appointment nobody had heard of. The foreign policy implications were serious, but the domestic political damage was worse, because the Mandelson scandal crystallized everything that was wrong with Starmer's government. The cronyism, the poor judgment, the willingness to ignore warnings, the instinct to defend the indefensible until public pressure forced a U-turn. This had been Labour's pattern for 7 months. Appoint someone controversial, defend them, wait for a scandal, fire them under pressure. It had happened 8 times now, 8 ministerial resignations or sackings in 7 months, more than any government in modern British history at this stage of its tenure. And each time, Starmer had made the same mistakes, appointed people with obvious flaws, ignored warnings from officials, defended them publicly, then abandoned them when the pressure became too intense. It wasn't leadership, it was damage control masquerading as governance, and the British public was losing patience. By late September, Labour was in free fall. They lost 3 by-elections in safe seats. Local election results showed a swing away from Labour of 12 points since July 2024. Reform UK was now leading national polls by 8 points. The Conservatives had recovered to second place. Labour was third, 14 months after a landslide victory. Keir Starmer's government was on the brink of collapse, and it had all started with one catastrophic appointment. The appointment of Peter Mandelson, the Prince of Darkness, despite his well-known links to Jeffrey Epstein. But here's what makes this story even more devastating. The Mandelson scandal wasn't just about one bad appointment. It revealed a systemic problem in how Keir Starmer made decisions. On 18th September, The Times published a leaked memo from the Cabinet Office. It showed that before Mandelson's appointment, 3 separate reviews had raised concerns. The security service, MI5, had flagged Epstein connections as a potential vulnerability. The Foreign Office had questioned whether Mandelson's history of resignations made him suitable for such a sensitive role. And the Cabinet Secretary had warned that appointing a political figure rather than a career diplomat would be controversial. Starmer had overruled all 3. He'd ignored his own officials. He'd dismissed security concerns. He'd prioritized political connections over institutional advice. And when confronted about this in Parliament, he'd lied. He'd claimed due process was followed, but due process doesn't mean ignoring every warning you receive. The revelation destroyed what little remained of Starmer's credibility, because it proved this wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate choice to appoint a compromised individual against professional advice. Opposition MPs were ruthless. The Prime Minister didn't just make an error of judgment, said Conservative Shadow Foreign Secretary Andrew Mitchell. He actively chose to ignore warnings from security services, diplomats, and civil servants. That's not incompetence, that's arrogance, and it's disqualifying. Labour backbenchers were equally critical. One MP, speaking anonymously to The Guardian, said, "We all knew Mandelson was controversial, but we trusted Keir's judgment. We thought he knew something we didn't. Now we discover he knew less than everyone else, and appointed him anyway. How can we trust him on anything?" The crisis escalated on 22nd September when former Cabinet Minister Andy Burnham gave a speech in Manchester. Popular, charismatic, and untainted by the Mandelson scandal, Burnham had stayed out of frontline politics since becoming Mayor of Manchester in 20. But now he made his move. Labour is in crisis, he said, not because of external forces, but because of internal failures. We promised integrity and delivered cronyism. We promised competence and delivered chaos. We promised a new kind of politics and gave them the old kind with different faces. This has to change, and if our current leadership can't change it, then we need new leadership. The speech was a direct challenge to Starmer's authority. Within 24 hours, 3 more Labour MPs publicly endorsed Burnham's assessment. Within 48 hours, bookmakers had him as favourite to be the next Labour leader. Within 72 hours, Downing Street was in panic mode because Andy Burnham wasn't some marginal backbencher. He was a serious politician with a strong base in the party membership, and he'd just positioned himself as the alternative to Keir Starmer. The Prime Minister tried to fight back. On 25th September, he gave a major speech promising Phase 2 of his government. New focus on delivery, new cabinet appointments, new approach to communication. But nobody was listening anymore. The narrative had shifted from Labour's fresh start to Starmer's survival. And once a Prime Minister is fighting for survival, they've already lost. The October opinion polls were catastrophic. Reform UK led nationally with 31%. Conservatives were second, with 26%. Labour had collapsed to 21%. In seat projections, Labour would lose its majority. Some models suggested they'd be the third largest party. 14 months after winning 401 seats, they were heading for electoral annihilation. And the reason was simple. The Mandelson scandal had crystallised every doubt voters had about Labour. Were they really different from the Conservatives? No, they appointed cronies too. Did they have better judgment? No, they ignored security warnings. Would they put country before party? No, they defended the indefensible until forced to back down. Keir Starmer had destroyed Labour's credibility in 7 months, and Peter Mandelson, the Prince of Darkness, had been the instrument of that destruction. But here's the final, darkest irony. Peter Mandelson had warned Keir Starmer this would happen. In private conversations before accepting the ambassador role, Mandelson had expressed concerns about the Epstein connection. He'd told Starmer it would be politically difficult. He'd suggested it might be better to appoint someone else, but Starmer had insisted. He told Mandelson the connection was old news. He'd promised to back him. He'd guaranteed full support, and for 7 months, he'd kept that promise, right up until the moment it became politically impossible. Then he'd fired Mandelson, without warning, without consultation, without even the courtesy of a proper conversation. The Prince of Darkness had been betrayed by the man he'd helped create. Because Keir Starmer's political career had been shaped by Peter Mandelson. When Starmer was Director of Public Prosecutions, it was Mandelson who'd spotted his political potential. When Starmer first ran for Parliament in 2015, it was Mandelson who'd provided strategic advice. When Starmer ran for Labour leader in 2020, it was Mandelson who'd worked behind the scenes to build support among MPs and party officials. Peter Mandelson had made Keir Starmer, and Keir Starmer had destroyed Peter Mandelson. That betrayal resonated through Labour, because if Starmer would sacrifice his mentor, his political godfather, the man who'd made his career possible, what wouldn't he sacrifice? Who was safe? The answer became clear in October 2025. Nobody. Starmer reshuffled his cabinet again, bringing in younger, less controversial figures, but the damage was done. Labour MPs no longer trusted his judgment, party members no longer believed his promises, and voters no longer gave him the benefit of the doubt. The Mandelson scandal had revealed something fundamental about Keir Starmer. He made decisions based on short-term political calculation, ignored professional advice when it conflicted with his preferences, and abandoned allies when they became liabilities. That's not leadership. That's survival instinct. And in politics, survival instinct without principle is a recipe for failure. By November 2025, the whispers of a leadership challenge had become open discussion. Andy Burnham announced he was standing down as Manchester Mayor to return to Parliament. His intention was obvious. Angela Rayner, despite her own resignation scandal, was positioning herself for a comeback. Rachel Reeves was having quiet conversations with backbenchers about what Labour needed. The party was fracturing, and at the centre of it all was Keir Starmer, isolated, defensive, clinging to power. The man who'd promised to restore integrity to British politics had destroyed his party's credibility by appointing Jeffrey Epstein's best pal as ambassador. Some mistakes in politics are survivable. Some errors can be explained, contextualized, forgiven, but this wasn't one of them. Because the Mandelson appointment wasn't a mistake, it was a choice to prioritize political connections over security concerns, a choice to ignore official warnings, a choice to value personal loyalty over institutional integrity. And when that choice became indefensible, Keir Starmer made another choice, to sacrifice the man who'd made his career possible, to blame everyone except himself, to pretend he hadn't been warned when the evidence proved he had. That's not the behavior of a prime minister. That's the behavior of a politician who's lost his way, and the British public could see it. They'd given Labour a landslide majority to restore trust in government. Instead, they'd gotten cronyism, scandal, and a prime minister who appointed a convicted sex offender's defender as ambassador. The story of Peter Mandelson and Keir Starmer isn't over. It's just beginning. Because this isn't about one scandal. It's about a pattern of poor judgment that's destroying Labour from within. It's about a prime minister who's lost the confidence of his party, his government, and his country. It's about the moment when Britain realized that the man they'd elected to fix politics was just as compromised as the people he'd replaced. Peter Mandelson, the Prince of Darkness, is gone, fired, disgraced, his reputation destroyed by emails he wrote nearly 2 decades ago. But he'll recover. He always does. He'll write a memoir. He'll give speeches. He'll remain relevant. Because Peter Mandelson understands power in a way most politicians never will. Keir Starmer, on the other hand, might not survive. Because once a prime minister loses trust, it's almost impossible to get it back. And Keir Starmer lost trust the moment he appointed Jeffrey Epstein's best pal as Britain's ambassador to America. Subscribe if you want to see how this story ends, because we're watching a government collapse in real time. The appointment that destroyed Labour, the judgment that ended a premiership, the moment when Britain's prime minister chose cronyism over country, and nobody knows what comes next.